Joanne Wilson, and this is Positively Gotham Gal. Real, honest, and meaningful conversations with women entrepreneurs about their approach to life, business, and everything in between.
All right, so we're just going to chat here, okay? And you know the topic because it's all about you. Thank you both, Courtney and Kelly, for joining us today. I mean, what is interesting is we're all, particularly you two more than me at this point, we're going through this crazy, like unprecedented wave of growth in recreation cannabis that each state appears to be stumbling through blindly. Even the ones that have watched the other states, they seem to be very blinded by it as well. So I wonder if both of you can sort of talk individually. We'll start with you, Courtney, on how you sort of ended up in this crazy industry that is going to be in a very, very different place a decade from now.
Yeah, how much time do you have? I'm just kidding. We always tell people, I had a mentor once that told me that life is like a lattice, not a ladder. And I certainly feel like, in cannabis, that's particularly true. No one's come off the cannabis ladder, not usually. I mean, now I guess it's been around long enough in some states that may be true, but by and large, people are coming to this industry from so many different walks of life and so many different areas of expertise. In my former background, I worked on marine mammal cognition and social behavior. And I got the southern resident orchids in the Puget Sound listed under the ECA from research that we did, and used to work with African elephants, and, had a whole background in sort of environmental sustainability prior to entering into cannabis. After Hurricane Katrina, I lost my job. I had $1,000 in a suitcase to my name. I moved to Hiroshima, planned to be there for 6 months, ended up learning Japanese and staying 4 years, then went to Thailand.
Oh my God, that's so
yeah, had such a journey.
Oh my God, what did you do after Thailand?
Well, I after my contract was up, I spent all my money traveling Southeast Asia, as some young person does, and then called my mother up, who lived in Denver, Colorado, and said, "Can I come live in your basement?" And because she's my mother and was forced to say yes, she said yes. So I said yes, and I moved into her basement, went to grad school. Had sort of decided that research, while incredibly powerful, wasn't really having the change that I wanted it to have in communities and in the sustainability movement and the community movement. So decided, I know what's going to fix it. I'll go do nonprofit work. So I got a master's in business with an emphasis in nonprofit management, the craziest degree ever. Got out, did about a decade of nonprofit consulting, and became really frustrated with the nonprofit industrial complex.
How?
It was so frustrating because there's all these people in power who don't really want change. They just want to keep the same cog turning.
Yes, they do.
Right. And so I really kind of had a long, slow breakup with the nonprofit sector. But during that process, I had helped. There was a founders of Denver Comic-Con, but my organization, my consulting firm, really helped steward them. And so in the beginning of Denver Comic-Con, they were working on a prison education program to teach folks in jail comic book literacy. And they were looking for funding and they couldn't find any. And at this time, cannabis is coming online. And so I said to myself, well, wouldn't it be interesting if we had this very vulnerable sector like this nonprofit that I'm working on, and this other very vulnerable sector like the cannabis industry, and somehow paired them together for greater mutual benefit? The cannabis industry obviously benefiting from the narrative that would be supporting local inmates and giving them literacy education, and of course this program by getting funding. So I worked for months and months and months on trying to curate funding for this nonprofit program because I really wanted to weave these two industries together. And of course, being a longtime cannabis user, I was really comfortable there. And at that time, got introduced to Kelly. And of course, there's always, so that's like, there's professional reasons why any of us join the industry. So my professional reason was I had expertise in community impact and community engagement, building nonprofits from nothing and fundraising. I had been a longtime cannabis user, but as cannabis is coming online, it's also occurring to me that most of my family, who's all in Louisiana, by the way, we came over on two German brothers came over as German pacifists during World War I on a boat, leaving the war and landed in New Orleans. And that's where my family's been ever since. And my whole family's there, grew up very, very poor, and they have a lot of illnesses, as you do when you grow up poor and in like, economically depressed areas. They were never going to have access to medicine,
Particularly Louisiana.
particularly Louisiana. And they were never going to have access to this medicine that had done so much for me. And so again, really looking at all the professional reasons to do this work, but also the very deeply personal reasons to do this work. Because I thought if we could change the story of cannabis, maybe someplace like Louisiana would eventually legalize it, and my family would have access to medicine, and be able to ease their pain and suffering, and maybe, just maybe, even have ease in death, right? As we know that cannabis and psychedelics can offer really extraordinary care during hospice. So that was the personal reason.
That's a great point. I mean, certainly the guy that is running for the Senate or the governor of Louisiana, who is a major stoner. I mean, his ads are so fabulous. I gave money to them and I saw it. But you do bring up a good point, and I'm curious what you're going to say, Kelly, is that everyone who's in the industry now has a reason. People get into different industries at different times. They have passions about it, but there is something about this nascent industry. Everyone has a story on why they've decided they need to be here at the beginning, regardless of being. So,
and if they have a good reason, we typically don't trust them, right? We're like, wait a second, you don't have a connection to the plant. I don't know if I trust you.
Yeah. Here for the money, no.
So anyway, I got introduced to Kelly by a guy named Rich Mail, and Kelly and I met in a coffee shop and started our business. We've been out in business 7 years together. And Kelly has her own path into cannabis, but we genuinely met in a coffee shop and started our business seriously the next day.
I love that. So Kelly, go back in quick time and how you said, "Oh yes, cannabis, that's for me."
Well, and we call those stories Cannabis Doing Good stories. So that's where Cannabis Doing Good came from, is because we realized there were so many folks who had never a chance with all the dirty drug dealer stigma stories. They never got to say, I helped my father who had AIDS. This isn't my story. This is a story we've heard, because the only ease that he had was from cannabis. And it was in the Mission in San Francisco, and nurses brought it to him. And I saw my father die with grace. And so that person founded a cannabis company, right? My story, I was brought to the governor's office from early childhood to create the Office of Early Childhood in Colorado. That's where I had come from community. And cannabis was legalized by the voters while I was there. So I had done a prescription drug abuse prevention effort.
Was it the first state or the second state?
Number one.
First, it was.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we did in parallel really with Washington on similar timelines, but we were the ones actually were up and running first. They had a better process than we did. We had a good Amendment 64 was a people's initiative because folks could not get legislators to take on the cause. And so it was a compromise without having policymakers really do it. And frankly, it's not fabulous policy, right? It's a bunch of who can we get to make the sausage that will pass? So we need some education folks. We need somebody here. We need somebody there. So we were kind of sold a platform. Regulate like alcohol was the attempt. That's why it was done, because this guy, Mason Trevert, is a person who was seeing so much alcohol abuse at college and was like, cannabis does not do the same thing. We should do this. So along with folks at Vicente Cedarburg and grassroots organizers and, maybe 3 criminal legal folks and 1 education person. So we kind of passed the money was going to go to education, which is not exactly true at all. When I looked at the legislation that came from the People's Initiative, I'm like, yeah, that's not what it is. So we don't even have the capacity or technology to do some of the things that are in the law, but it's the first $41 million for capital school construction. That's not education. That's a grant program. So anyway, what I could see is all I care about, and I was a consumer. And before I was hired there, I was like, so how often do they drug test, right? And I had originally said no, because I have 5 children. I still have 5 children, thankfully. I work part-time. I'm like, that's not a job for me. And the person who's my mentor called me back and said, how about 4 days a week? And I was like, oh, hell yeah. So cannabis comes on board. The governor doesn't want anything to do with it. Nobody in the governor's cabinet wants anything to do with it. But I had just crafted with the governor a prescription drug abuse prevention effort that was really good. That was taking all the different stakeholders with, opioid overdose. And I didn't know what the solution was, but my style is go to who's touching the problem, talk to all the stakeholders, and let's come up with something. So I'd go to the doctors and they're like, don't tell us what to do. I'm like, no problem. I don't know what to do. But it was a really good process, and the governor was very happy with it. So I could use that same kind of public health framing to say cannabis is that thing too. You don't need to stick your head in the ground. I promise you, no one's going to die. We're going to frame this the same way: public health, intervention, prevention, treatment, recovery. And so that it helped me to create the Office of Marijuana Coordination, to think about all the state departments that were going to be required to do something with this implementing legislation to make this thing go, and have some really frank conversations around, why do you think it's going to be all bad? Why is it all bad? Is public health department not looking for anything that this might help, gastrointestinal, anything, right? Just kind of change the narrative, because I was an anti-racist person. I was worked in racial equity for 25 years. So that was always the way I looked at things. And in our law, I saw nothing that was going to impact mass incarceration, nothing that was going to impact the war on drugs. We just had what we had. And I could drill down and see zones like alcohol. I called Denver, because this is municipal by municipal decision. Denver, Colorado is legalizing, but you all are actually going to craft the first policies in the world. And they said, no one has ever come over to our office from your office. We're across the street. The city's across the street from the state capitol. I don't know. I did a crazy thing. I just walked over there. And so we're not thrilled with how Denver's rolled it out. But in terms of regulatory revenue modeling, Colorado did a really good job in terms of having a law that, that reduces inequity or centers the people who paid the price for this, Black and brown people, nothing. And so I was there about 3 years, and that's about as long as you could stay. And I got a fabulous job doing like racial equity, early childhood stuff nationally that didn't pan out. And when I came, I was still in Denver, but when I saw where cannabis was rolling out, it was the very same communities I had relationships with working on health issues, because I'm a public health person, I'm a racial equity person. And so they were pushing back, Black and brown communities, pushing back, saying, we don't want cannabis here. They're here to take advantage of us. And I had relationships, and I could say, I know it feels that way, but they were zoned there because alcohol was also disproportionately negative policy for communities of color. So Courtney and I couldn't stop like what was going to happen, but we could go to the mayor and say, these communities are going to be so impacted. Their property taxes are going to raise. They're not going to be able to live here. And we're facilitating workshops in communities saying cannabis is here, whether you like them or not. They're not the ones who decided to be here, and they don't know anything about your community. How about if we orient them to what matters here? And you might think about, what would it look like for cannabis to be an asset here? And that's really, that's the company Courtney and I started, is that we knew the city council arguments. We knew people in community just feeling like, what are you doing here to take advantage of us? That is the way policy works, but it's not these people. Why don't we see what they can offer? And the community had so much to say. It was nuts. And we could highlight what they cared about. Scholarships is what they wanted most of all. And Courtney and I are like, we can't tell the community what they want, but you don't want that because you won't live here. And as crappy as that sounds, it's the truth. And so a land trust is the first thing that we tried to get support for. And it's up and running. It's the first thing we supported as Cannabis Doing Good, but too little, too late. And that's such a unique story. That's not the story other places. Cannabis should be groomed to be what it should be in community. What is an asset in the community?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think what's interesting, and when you talk about government, is government is literally incapable of figuring anything out at a broad scale level where they are up in the clouds. They just don't, because most of them have spent all their time in government. And, the way that our system works is one law turns into multiple laws and changes and morphs over time. And eventually, hopefully, we get to a place that it makes a lot of sense. I mean, even now there's lawsuits going through systems that have nothing to do with cannabis, but they have to do with new precedent that's been set that, people are like, yes, this person was horrendous, but there's no precedent in our law system against it. So where do you find that to build upon that? It's a very overwhelming, large, wieldy system, that keeps lawyers employed and a lot of government officials employed.
Well, and we didn't set up our system to take its direction from the people. We set up representative government. And so you're hoping that those people are doing the thing. But organizers and racial equity experts and like these people aren't the same people that are crafting the policies, that don't necessarily know the potential impact of what they're doing. So what we always say is policy is necessary, but not sufficient to make change. And policymakers are just doing what they feel directed to do, that they think is the right thing. And that big picture, holistic vision, that's very hard for anyone to have. Regulators certainly don't have it. It's a completely different mindset. And it's really hard as an individual player and community to see that the impact of all these, systems that are working together or not working together. So there's a lot of work to do. And we started our company to figure out how can we make the case for cannabis to be an asset in community, for cannabis to support efforts in community. And we are always beholden to community. Don't hire us if you aren't recognizing that, because that's the way that we're oriented. We get the war on drugs. We have always talked about it 8 years ago when we started, or 7 years ago, because whole communities were damaged by lack of political regard and political power.
Destroyed.
The impact of the drug war is one thing. Redlining, another thing. The mortgage crisis, another thing. Property taxes, funding education. We have all these systems of inequity built in. And if you're trying to run a business in that, because we're still hyperlocal, cannabis will always be hyperlocal, even when the feds say yes. The local community decides. So they need to know everything so they can have influence that supports the health of the community, the environment, righting injustices, paying people fair wages, really being, so that's our vision. And that is what we've always sought to do. And we just do it in different ways. And now we can be more explicit with how we talk about it.
So let's talk about those different ways. So you guys get together, you have a cup of coffee, and you're obviously talking the same thing. And you just probably are like bonded and said, okay, this is what we're going to do. So let's walk back. Like, what exactly, in some very simple terms, explains what you're doing with Cannabis Doing Good?
Yeah, well, so when we started 7 years ago, we actually started as Kind Colorado. So Kind Colorado, we started off the first few months as a nonprofit, very quickly decided we were not a nonprofit, went back to our lawyers and said, you need to do reformation. We're actually a business. And started Kind Colorado, which was
happy, Courtney, since after your issue.
Yes, so happy. We have resisted, and we have a nonprofit sister now, Cannabis Impact Fund, which we'll talk about. But there was some major resistance. Kelly and I got on the phone and said, we have to do this. We really don't want to do this because we didn't want to have a nonprofit, but we felt like we had to for many reasons. But got started as a consulting firm and really looked at, our approach to corporate social responsibility was really rooted in anti-oppression and racial justice and coming out of the drug war. So we created a new process for social responsibility called Cannabis Social Responsibility, and trademarked that and started really implementing that as a consulting service across the country. We grew very, very quickly as a consulting firm, and then started trademarking, Kind California and Kind Canada and Kind Washington, because we thought, okay, we have dreams of scaling this consultancy in terms of being able to train lots of people in cannabis social responsibility. Let's train experts in cannabis social responsibility and get this work across the country. But what we realized is that doing consulting, even handfuls of clients at a time, we weren't moving quick enough. We just weren't moving quick enough. And we wanted to have greater impact. And we also realized that there were a lot of the clients that we were serving were kind of already on the train, right? But what we really needed was this entire station built. We needed to get people on the platform of really understanding purpose-driven cannabis, of the conscious cannabis movement, which is rooted in racial equity and sustainability and community benefits. So we launched Cannabis Doing Good. And the way that we launched it was was by throwing in a fundraising event first. We called them Parties with a Purpose. They were Cannabis Doing Good socials. We decided to invite 60% industry, 40% community and policymakers, and just stakeholders, from the area. And we benefited a local land trust. This was our first one. We expected 50 people to walk through the door, 150 people walk through the door. And then within a few months, we're throwing 1,000-person events in St. Louis, Vegas, New Orleans, MJ Biz, Minorities for Medical Marijuana. All these different companies are contacting us saying, please come throw these purpose-driven Parties with a Purpose events at our conference in our town. And we looked around and said, okay, we wanted to determine, is there a need, a want, and a desire for a purpose-driven cannabis community? And we sort of heard hell yes, right? Because of these events, which was really our way to test the market. And after we did these events for a couple of years, we launched the awards program, which was a way to be able to acknowledge those companies who were doing really well in racial justice and sustainability and community benefits. So we launched the awards program. Then we launched a digital storytelling series called the Cannabis Doing Good Stories, where we set up a studio and people could come by and tell their purpose-driven cannabis stories. Again, we expected 7 people to sign up. We had 50 people sign up. We had to, schedule multiple studio days to be able to capture all the stories that were told. We released the video at MJ Biz in Vegas. I really started seeing some success here, right? Through the events and through the awards and through our storytelling. But the main goal was always, how do we take what we do and scale it? To be really transparent, because I feel like we must be, the first thought was membership. Let's launch a membership organization. Let's take all these people that have been coming to our events and let's put them in our ecosystem, and let's find ways to care for them, nurture them, connect them to each other, and really build this purpose-driven movement. And it took us a pretty long time to get our membership program off the ground, which is still alive and well, but it still doesn't crack the nut of how do we take what we do, scale it, and touch more businesses more quickly. And that's really how we've gotten to the latest iteration of Cannabis Doing Good, which, by the way, still does events, we still do awards, and we have a membership program. But what we really found that we do well outside of our consulting is take all that IP, all those workshops, all this training, all this stuff that we've trademarked and protected and worked on the last 7 years, and let's turn it into digital content. And let's start licensing that content to companies across the country as part of their licensing requirements, as part of their onboarding and training for staff, as part of their recruitment and engagement strategies for C-suite. Let's take all this and start digitizing it. And we started doing that. And that's been a really beautiful way to scale our business. And so today, we kind of have our 3 primary ways we engage companies. We still offer white glove consulting for cannabis companies, and we have major partners across the country who work with us to basically sell our consulting services. We have our membership program, which captures businesses who are looking to be recognized as a purpose-driven brand. They want to be badged as a purpose-driven brand, because we do that also. They want to be awarded, and they want to be connected to other people like them and other vendors like them. And then or other brands. And then and now we have our licensed content, which is really what we've done to sort of scale all the juicy bits of our consulting and our workshops and our training and license it out to businesses. So those are really the 3 ways that business engage with us today.
And then in terms of the social responsibility, because I know all 3 of us feel the same, which is, you've got a new industry that has been doing quite fine and dandy for years, for people that have been able to sell it and smoke it. We've done no research as a country, although certainly other countries have continued to do massive research, Israel being one in the forefront, on how do you use this as a medical plant, which essentially is what it is. But of all the horrendous things we've done as a country, which is essentially destroying Black and brown communities, by throwing people in jail over something that makes 0 sense to all 3 of us, what is the large, because I've, now that I'm starting to dip into it and give money back, and I feel making the right points of contact to affect people that have been getting out of jail, keeping them out of jail, getting them jobs. Some of the large companies that we all know that are publicly traded, most up in Canada because they were able to jump on the stock market, not here yet. Some are doing great, some are doing shitty. Like, who is really leading the charge in an industry? Is it the smaller ones, the bigger ones, the new ones that are thinking about the importance of putting a percentage of this capital into social change, or making sure that's a big piece of their business?
That's a great question. And I don't think we have so many winners yet. I mean, we have some that we could point to. I don't know any Black or brown women in the space that their mission isn't that. I mean, we're thinking of 40 Tons, Corvain Cooper, who was given a life sentence in California and recently got out and started a company with some of his friends. He's a legacy market operator, 3 nonviolent cannabis crimes, and in prison for life. He's not able to ever have a license, but his company, 40 Tons, because that was literally what he was charged with, moving in North Carolina. And he looked at that newspaper clipping every day, 40 tons, which wasn't real. And so their company is so impressive. It's a Black woman run, definitely minority owned. And part of their business model is to fill the commissary cards of folks who are still in prison.
That's awesome.
We just served on a panel or participated in the Cannabis Marketing Association Summit that was here in Denver, thankfully. And the head of that, Lisa Buffo, is a young woman who's a complete badass, who's so mission driven and has been, was his pen pal while he was in prison, and said to him, "When you get out, tell me what you need." Well, he just keynoted this conference. And so what you do exactly, we help companies and people craft what is the best thing for you to do, which is in alignment with you. This racialized story of anti-Blackness and horror dispensed on communities, that's all of our story. The way that it is, how you engage and how you disrupt it, we help you craft, because being an anti-racist company in cannabis is critically important. It means you are acknowledging, right, that this history is all of ours.
Yes.
That's the story. If you don't like the story, we sure don't. We are deeply committed to crafting a different story, because we think that the good money, as the people's ecosystem likes to say, and they're a great example of the LGBTQIA owned, BIPOC owned, always the mission about taking care of community, because that's their legacy operators. That's what they were always doing, right? So it's that inclination to, what is your story? Is it about access to medicine? Recognizing reducing racial inequity is always going to be part of your story. How you do it, we help you craft, because we know it's not easy even when you want to do it. How are you centering that the Earth's resources are limited? And if you care about this plant and have a connection to it, you did not get into it to fill landfills with plastic, right? So that's policy trying to take care of frightened people. We on the inside have to help change the minds, so that those folks aren't clamoring for 13 layers of plastic, but rather, this isn't something for you to be afraid of. You were told some really bad things and associated with criminality and Blackness and jazz and sex and all the things, that's just so ridiculous. But that anti-Black story still impacts all of the things: access to capital, access to real estate, access to housing, how you're going to find your diverse staff. I mean, to us, it all relates. And so our anti-racism training, our very foundational training, really names, here are the systems. You didn't craft them, I didn't craft them, but here's what they are, very clear-eyed. We add some of our expertise from Brene Brown and Tarana Burke and Resmaa Menakem about kind of the somatic shame experience of race. And we work with companies and say, we know you want to hire more Black people. We're not really going to help you do that unless we can help you also be a place that isn't toxic, because you didn't become all white just instantly, and you didn't decide probably just to get there. There's all these other things in the way. So if you want to disrupt that, let's name it, let's look at it, let's take care of ourselves, recognize that there's no industry that's doing this well. It ought to be us. We ought to be helping all other industries, because this is still dynamic policy and business practices. It's all still changing, and what our values are need to be bubbled up to what the values are. We're not going to be an extractive, racialized, capitalist system that just takes from the planet and its people and discards what it doesn't care about.
So ensuring essentially that a brand new industry is going down the right pathway, right? So you're helping these companies really think about, as they're hiring, as they're creating a culture within their community, to be very thoughtful about the historical wrongs that were done. So you talk about women as two females. I mean, one thing that I noticed at the beginning was there was a lot of women starting to build brands, but so much has shifted in the last couple of years. Are you seeing enough females in this arena? Are we seeing too many white men that are just jumping in with no stories, like we were talking about earlier, that are just seeing the bandwagon of cash and capital in a brand new industry? And how do we change that?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Kelly and I will probably answer this somewhat differently, but with the same goal in mind. Do we want a more diverse industry with more Black, brown, women, and queer leadership? 100%.
Definitely.
However, to be really honest, our business model is catered to that 90+% of the industry that's white run, because there are so many things that are going to have to change for the color and the demographics of our industry to shift. And we are actively working on that from a policy perspective and a community organizing perspective, and our involvement with organizations like MCBA and M4MM and others. And what we acknowledge is that today we have a majority white run industry. And they are so terrified of being called out that they have paralysis around progress. They're so terrified of doing the wrong thing and being canceled that they won't even touch conversations around racial equity.
You would think, if anything, it would be Well, you do see some that are giving out tremendous amount of capital to very interesting organizations that have shown their impact, and others that are just giving like fluff. Um, and I mean, I don't. All I can think about, the thing that comes to my mind is like the Me Too, right? I mean, they won't be Me Too'd because we're hopefully have given some serious thought to that moving forward, but they will be called out at one point of not doing the right thing for the communities.
That's right. And they're terrified of it. But what we've really come to realize is that there are lots of people in and out of this industry that are more than happy to call people out. There's very few people calling people into this work and saying, show up with courage, because shame isn't going to kill you. It can be uncomfortable, but it's not going to kill you. And how do we call people into the work? We first do that by just talking about how we got here, what are the steps forward for progress, and how it's going to be tied into the business. And so one of the first things that we did when Cannabis Doing Good really started coming up with its suite of products and services was develop the racial equity self-assessment. We call it the RESA. And the RESA is a way to call people in. It scores companies, predominantly white companies, although we've done companies of color, of course, but it was initially created for white companies, and it scores them in 5 key areas: company commitments, HR, community engagement, policy and advocacy, and marketing and communications.
Awesome.
And the goal is just to give people a baseline. Like, here's where you can't possibly move people forward in any sort of continuum if we don't know from where they're starting.
Yes.
And they need to know from where they're starting. So we can bring a company in, give them the score. It's not publicized. It'll never be public. Again, our goal is not to call them out. It's just to give them the RESA, let them have a score in each section, and then sit down with them and say, okay, so here are your areas of opportunity for growth based on your answers. Now they know clearly from where they've started. Each question is highly informative, so they know exactly where they're going. And in a year's time, they can take it again and see how their score is improved. And they're going to be able to track each one of these areas to business metrics, right? And so I think that there is the moral value and virtue for why we do the work. There's the policy reasons for why we do the work. But what's really compelling in our experience to most white-run businesses is the business reason to do this work. And by the way, there's lots of good business reason to do this work that's going to increase revenue, right? It's going to increase return on investment for your investors. It's going to engage brand loyalty. It's going to enhance customer satisfaction. It's going to retain your staff for longer periods of time. We knew that doing racial equity and equity work in businesses drives business growth. But how to do it is always the trick.
It is.
Right?
I mean, I would also think, you've got 5 people sitting around a table that's a C-suite. And, sometimes the person who's the head of the table is thinking very differently in their RESA than the other members around the table, which is the best way to start that, because too many times have I seen companies where it just gets to a point where the person who's sitting at the king's table essentially is not listening to all of the people that they've hired that are all fantastic with great advice and thought processes and very diverse. But if you're not giving those people a voice and you're not integrating it into the way that you're managing, and saying, oh, you know what, they might have something here that doesn't go anywhere.
That's right. I think that there is so much concern for C-suite to be focused on proximity, product, and price, right? But we know that Gen X and millennials, which by the way are most of the age groups of those folks that they're hiring, the people who make their team are Gen X and millennials, and even younger than millennials. Now I don't know what that one is anymore, centennials or whatever comes under millennials. I don't know what they are. They're moving into the workforce. They care about purpose. They care about purpose.
Yes,
right. And so you have proximity, product, and price, but purpose is what's going to drive them to your store every single time.
I agree.
Right. So how about asking them? How about asking the very staff that are going to be shaping the entire economics of your store and of your location and of your brand, saying, what do you care about?
Right. And what foot should we be putting forward?
And what do the regulators care about, who will be assuring you can operate or not? Because the legacy market is twice as successful as the regulated market, and that is always out there. the differentiation between brands, the making a name for yourself, as Courtney said, that this is this. And Mr. Floyd's death gave us a whole new kind of framework for everyday people to have some basic understanding of what systemic racism is. And cannabis is trying to use, that's what social equity laws are about. They're trying to make repair from the race-based inequitable policy, but they're not making solutions race-based because we still live in a really racist culture. We just do.
Yes, we do. From the day that we hit America.
Right. Never in our time, though, have we had, for me, someone in racial equity and in community organizing for a long time. Never have I seen an economic driver for the change that I would like to see, ever. So what potential we have, right? And naming it straight up, like you cannot operate in cannabis without having some understanding of the war on drugs and prohibition and the continuing impact, even though we know that information is like slowly coming. And then, as I mentioned, we have new understanding about we were probably taught don't say race unless you were born in New York City, right? Don't mention it. Like, don't say it. That's the right thing to do. Well, we know that isn't the right thing to do anymore. That inclusion really means a sense of belonging, that who I am, I bring it, and I'm welcome. And I don't have to have this different face that I can bring to the office or code switch every single thing, keep my whole life different. That's different from Courtney's, aside. It's in part of our business.
I was going to say, I mean, if you look at the government, who has not, in many states, said you have no choice but must give a percentage of your business back to social good, and we are going to follow up on that to see where that money is going. Which is such as from the nonprofit world. I mean, I sat on the board of the Highline, and I basically said to them, I'm not giving you any money until 10% of everything you take in, from $1 to $100 million, goes towards a maintenance fund. End of story, right? And so I feel it's the same thing with these businesses in cannabis. I mean, they certainly need to change the laws at the government level so that everyone can make the capital that they should, and they should be able to deduct their business expenses just like a normal business. It should be run like any liquor business that makes money. They've made it very difficult at the federal level, hoping that will change. There will be banking. But if you want these organizations to give back a piece of this capital that they're going to make, and keep in mind, these small stores are making tremendous amount of money. So as long as the narrative from the government has been like, shame, shame on weed, the second that each state opened up, it was like, it's obvious, like, Americans like to get stoned. Because everyone's buying it. Talk a little bit about the Cannabis Impact Fund and what that is that sort of aligns with your mission and your profit company that helps industry leaders and people that own companies think about their businesses.
Courtney, you want to jump in?
Oh, no, I know this is your baby. I want you to do,
It is a little bit of my baby, but also just to touch on, like, Courtney and I are actually responsible for, with the folks in the Bay, for that community benefit piece. We literally crafted that. That is what cannabis social responsibility is that we don't even think of it as giving back. This is crafted off the backs of Black and brown, sick, and Indigenous people, period. It is not a giving back. It is a responsibility of an operator to, and when you think of, Joanne, you mentioned alcohol, right? If you think about what is alcohol done in community good, they don't have the same kind of responsibility that, and corporate responsibility specifically came out of, oh, we're so sorry we jacked up your water supply, you can't drink it anymore, and you all have cancer around the nuclear plant. Let us give you some money, right? So wrong, such an apology. We literally didn't craft the harm, but our policies and our business practice should be deeply connected to what is the repair, because it also makes you money. It also gets you employees. It also makes you a community asset. And so there's that framing. We've always been talking about racial justice, the war on drugs, the 48,000 collateral damage laws, if you were swept up in the war, which we got directly from Hood Incubator. We want to name them because there's so much impact if you have a felony. Like, our whole policies were crafted to exclude the people that literally paid the price. And they can never enter the industry. They can never benefit from it. Hopefully, their community could benefit from an opportunity to have fresh food, built environment, a rec center. I mean, the most basic things to repair harm done from this over-policing and et cetera, et cetera. So when Mr. Floyd was killed, we already know the difficulty of getting nonprofits to be able to work with cannabis because of all the things you've already said around 280E and nervousness because it's federally illegal. We know how to do it. It's certainly not impossible. If you're about change making, we can help you find a way. But that barrier exists. And we knew cannabis at large was not able to contribute to the movement for Black lives, right? We're parallel, we're connected, but not quite connected. My policy work has connected me to Policy Link and some others that do this because I'm a policy person, national dialogue. And I could say, hey, I'm cannabis too, which had its price in lots of places, but not with Policy Link. You know, this is an economic driver that could potentially impact local communities. And we wanted to make sure that cannabis could contribute. So because we had relationships with Color of Change, we built relationships with Bail Project, we built relationships with Black Futures Lab, which is Alicia Garza from the Black Movement for Black Lives policy effort to craft just policies. Then Hood Incubator inside of cannabis that builds Black cannabis businesses, but in a larger sense has this cannabis justice project, which is about really making all the change, the 48,000 laws, like making this right. And Minorities for Medical Marijuana because of all the good work that they do, building Black and brown businesses, and their second job of moving policy forward, their third job of creating access to industry, so much good stuff. So we make the right thing easy, right? So a cannabis business, when we crafted the Cannabis Impact Fund from the nonprofit Sensible Colorado, that was one of the forefront folks working on Amendment 64. They had a dormant nonprofit since legalization happened. Courtney and I bugged them for a number of years. Every time we saw them, so what are you doing with that nonprofit? What are you doing? And they were the ones who told us to be a nonprofit originally. So it's a wacky story. But we did a statewide drive for at the beginning of COVID called CDG Gives, and they donated and realized how clunky it was to donate to us. So that was another piece that we could say, help us make it easier for folks to donate, and we can move this money to the movement for Black Lives, bringing some more connectivity to us. Because if you're in cannabis, you're kind of doing cannabis. If you're working for, human liberation, you're probably just working on human liberation, but we kind of do it all. So we're so pleased to have been able to do that and build this work and make the connections and help hopefully other community nonprofits or efforts, because you don't have to be a nonprofit to take cannabis money. You're not going to write it off anyway, likely, right? You could be part of really doing some self-care in communities that cannabis can help support, which also builds your business, is also an ambassador for you, moves you through the licensing process, builds your team on the inside. So to us, it just makes so much sense. And we always want to make the right thing easy because nothing in this space is easy, but the Impact Fund does make it easy. And if you're a new company and you're trying to say how you are contributing to community, we always want you to do local. We also know it might be hard for you to find a local partner that will work with you because people still have their anti-Black stigma ideas about weed. You can contribute to us. We're supporting nationally, and then keep finding your partners because it's important.
Yeah, I mean, we're doing the same thing at Gotham Gives, which is a public charity. Essentially, people that are enlightened and excited about what we're giving back to, and we oversee it. Right, we oversee that money is being executed properly. We talk to these organizations on a weekly basis. We don't just say, "Here's the money, see you later." And so I do feel that we've had people write us checks because they're super psyched what they're doing. They want to give back, but they don't have the bandwidth to actually execute on their capital. They can just write the check, and that's about as much as they can handle, which is fine. Right? Everyone works for them. Um, so anyway, thank you guys so much for coming on. I'm sure we could talk about this for like 3 hours, but I love what you're doing, and I love the pairing of that nonprofit with what you're doing organizationally. Even I wish that there were organizations like this around when the tech companies were being built. I mean, they have a huge problem, and it's very hard to change a culture. It's really hard. I mean, even if you're a huge company and you bring in a new CEO, to change culture that's been in place for a long time is really difficult. And what you two are doing is anyone who is starting a cannabis business should bring you in at the beginning because it will help you create the right culture and the right acknowledgement that every employee has a nod to what has happened and a nod to what we need to do to move going forward.
And it's cannabis culture. We're like remembering our roots. Like the cannabis story is about liberation and healing and racial connections. That's why Nixon went after all of us, so they could break that shit up. Right? So remember, who are we? We are change makers. We are rebels. Some of us went to jail. Some of us died. Some of us lost their children. Some of us have grown cannabis on these lands for 1,600 years and can't. Right? So that is our story. And what do we want to do with it? Personally, Courtney and I, we want to tell a story of like, that is, we remembered and we brought us back to one another and back to the planet and honored the plant.
And for Pete's sake, be able to actually model that you can do well by doing good, right? It's part of the reason we were so like, I don't want to be a nonprofit. Like, we should be able to make good money, and all of our clients and people in our ecosystem make really good money by doing great work in community. Those things go together.
I agree.
So we have to model it.
Yeah, you now have a model. I would hope most would follow it, because the nonprofit, as much as they want to do good, their execution level is sometimes extremely poor.
And slow, very, very slow.
Yeah. And
because we're rebels, we can ask them. We tell cannabis companies, don't support the nonprofit industrial complex. Who's making change? Not who's keeping their 60-person nonprofit organization afloat. Who's making change in community? Because I'm not trying to hold things exactly as they are. We are disruptors, and we mean to be in the potential that's out there. And we get to do it. Like, what a privilege to get to do it.
I love rebels. I'm a rebel too.
Of course you are.
We know. Oh, we know.
All right. Well, thank you both for coming on, and we will obviously be in touch.
Thank you, Joanne.
Thanks so much for having us.